in the book. And I am not actually sure I understand. So if you have any insight on that, Mr. Bevel, I would be happy to listen to that. Oh, looks like Robin might have an answer.
So what occurs to me is that Solomon was enamored with Sheba and she had a certain hold on him. And it's reminiscent of the king and Anne.
And
So
yet
that's-
it's Cromwell's.
Yes.
Cromwell is the one with the obsession. He's the one who ends up with the tapestry. He keeps mentioning a woman named Anselma, and we're going to learn more about her. So I don't want to give away too much. There will be an answer to your question, Michael, but
You have to wait a while.
a little bit.
So I will just say, in my research, just to understand the story of Sheba and Solomon itself, there are many different theories about it. So it was, first of all, very difficult to sort of figure out which of the stories would be most consistent with what we're looking at. But I'm excited to hear that we are going to get to the bottom of that very pressing question.
All right. I'm going to start us off actually in the 19th century. So one of the interesting things about Queen Victoria is she is a woman, not to spring anything on anyone. And she's a woman in England at the time that the middle class is ascending. And what is happening is, and those of you who have been with me in my Victorian discussions have heard a lot of this before, and so I won't dwell too much on this part of it, but what's happening in England is the idea of what a family is, or the ideal of what a family is finally being sort of codified. So Victoria is in this interesting liminal space because on the one hand, she is the ruler of England and she is ruler of the British Empire. But on the other hand, she's also her husband's wife. And as far as the norms of the time go, and as far as what the society is expecting, a woman is subservient to her husband. But Victoria does this very interesting thing where she continually keeps Albert from having any position of authority, because I think she realizes that to give an inch is to give away all. And she can't act in the 19th century the way other women are acting, because everything about her upbringing, everything about her culture, everything about the nature of being a monarch dictates to some degree what she can do. And I bring her up because I think she's an interesting comparison when we start talking about Henry, because Henry also is in a unique position. He's part of a line, the Tudor line, that did not come to the throne by blood, but came to the throne by force. And he is the second son, and he was pampered. And there's, at least in Mantell's version, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a second, but in Mantell's version, Wolsey makes that comment that we should let him, like when he's first king, let him have his way, let him play, let him get this out of his system. Unfortunately, instead of getting it out of his system, it seemed to reify those behaviors in him. When we talk about Henry, we have to talk about him within the context of the way the monarchy is understood in the 16th century, which is, primarily a bloodline, but the Tudors have sidestepped that. And one of the ideas that is prevalent in the 16th century is they must have been allowed to sidestep that because God allowed that to happen, because God would not allow something to happen that shouldn't in the religious purview of these people. So the challenge that we can have, I think, as readers of this novel and of this series is confusing the actual Henry VIII, whatever that means, and use him in place of this character that Mantell is building. And so we may think in our heads he's doing one thing because we've got, it's almost like how you can't see the Mona Lisa anymore because you've seen it so much, there's no way you can ever come to it with beginner's eyes. Henry sort of falls into that category too. We've known so much about him. He's the butt of jokes and all this other stuff. Like, he doesn't come to us unknown. And yet the job and the challenge for us as readers is to discover what the writer is trying to tell us. So that's the one thing. The other thing that I want to cover really quickly, because Jeff asked in an email if I would talk about this, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Reformation, because that's a big deal. So the first thing to know is there are a lot of Reformations happening around this time and earlier. There are big changes within the structure of the church. And in a lot of what I'm about to say, we're going to talk about the church not so much as a holy space, but we're going to talk about it as a corporation. And so there were starting to be disagreements within the church. And the church in this case means Catholic with a small c, not Catholic with a big C. So Catholic with a small c just means universal. So there's the Catholic Church, which is the universal church, which is unfortunately really just Western Europe, because we don't pay attention to the East or Asia at this time. They don't exist until we can colonize them. That's how the West deals with things. So there starts to be schisms about what is required to be a good church. And there starts to be schisms about the influence that the heads of these different factions can have. One of the reasons Constantine probably chose to align himself with Christianity is because he got a political lift from it, and he also got some money from it. And when we look at what's happening in the church in this novel and in this time period, we're also, again, looking at not transactions of spirituality or holiness, but we're looking at literal fiscal transactions. One of the reasons the Pope does not want to readily grant Henry an annulment, which is something he might have done easily before, is because it's going to offend the Holy Roman Emperor, who is antagonistic toward the church in Rome. So the Pope is trying to balance two things. The Emperor is the nephew of Catherine of Aragon. So there's also that issue to contend with. So I guess to get back to the original point, there's lots of reformations. The English Reformation, what starts there and what we're concerned about in this book, really starts in the 15th century. And it picks up what's happening on the continent. In book 4, there's that scene where a woman is burned at the stake and she's a Lollard. And Lollards, the way most religious groups get their names is, I'm probably seeing, there's probably things that are happening. Nope, okay, perfect. I thought I was missing some chats. The Lollards were an early form. They're proto-Protestants. And the other thing that's important to keep in mind is we call them Protestants today, but at the time they did not use that term. They would have used the term evangelical. So we're going to put Henry's issue aside just for a second. And the main tension between the Catholic Church and the evangelicals is the tension between works and faith. So the Catholic Church says the way to salvation is through works, which means doing specific things. Praying the rosary, lighting candles, indulgences, all these things, which also, by the way, have a price tag to them. So if you go to church, you're required to give. So there's a financial transaction all the time. The evangelicals, who will eventually become our Protestants, say, nope, it has nothing to do. It doesn't matter how much you pray. It doesn't matter if you have a vial of the Virgin's milk. None of that matters. What matters is we are all sinners in the hand of an angry God, and it is our faith in our relationship with God, and it's our faith in our understanding of the Bible that is key. An interesting thing, I'm reading a history of the Reformation, like the whole Reformation. And there were priests who could not read. So they learned the Bible from picture books. And so if they could describe what was going on in the picture, they could describe to the congregation what that sermon is supposed to be about. And I found that very fascinating. Henry himself never becomes a Protestant, but he breaks with the capital C Catholic Church because for several reasons. The famous reason is he wants a divorce. The reason that we don't talk a lot about is the Praemunire, which is having a foreign faction within your own country to whom people are spending allegiance. And this had been an issue that England had been struggling with even before Henry. Henry just happened to be the one to finally take that final step and break the relationship. But England was very concerned about how much money was leaving England and going to Rome, and how little money was coming from Rome and going to England. And in a sense, Henry may have thought, I have bought an annulment because my country has been sending all this money for a while. Now, when there's that, the Protestants in this novel, people who we can say are legit Protestants, are Thomas Cromwell, the Boleyn family, so that's Anne and everyone else. And sorry, not in this novel, but actually I don't think she shows up in any of the novels because everybody who we care about is dead before she hits the scene. Catherine Parr, who is the last wife of Henry, she's also a Protestant. Henry is not a Protestant. His son, Edward, that he has with Jane Seymour, is a Protestant king, but then that's quickly wrenched away from him by Bloody Mary after he dies, and she turns the country back to Catholic again, before Elizabeth tries to thread the narrow way and appease both sides and doesn't do a great job with that at all. An English person after the break, let's say, and I don't have the exact date, but let's say Tuesday, Henry said, we're done, it's official. I'm the head of the church in England, and the Pope can be the head of the church wherever he wants to be. So that's Tuesday. On Wednesday, if you go to church, not a whole lot changes. You still have baptism and you still have the Eucharist. What is dropped eventually are, so Catholicism has 7 sacraments. It's baptism, Eucharist, confirmation, reconciliation, anointing of the sick, marriage, and holy orders. What happens between the Universal Catholic Church and the Anglican Church is the Anglican Church drops those 5 confirmation, reconciliation, anointing, marriage, and holy orders, but keeps baptism and the Eucharist. And actually, after the Protestant Reformation, there's going to be a Baptist Reformation, because the Baptists want to say childhood baptism doesn't count. You have to be baptized as an adult for it to count. So the other thing that happens is every religious employee in England after the switch needed to profess their loyalty to King Henry. And that's going to come up in this book with Thomas More, because in a sense, aligning yourself with Henry. I'll get to that, Jeff. Where was I going? Oh, shoot. Sorry, Jeff. I'll just
It
answer your
wasn't,
question.
Mike, it wasn't just religious offices. Up into the 20th century, you had to be an Anglican to go to
To hold political office, yeah.
no, but to go to university.
Oh,
To be an officer, you know, it was there was something. What's it called? The 33 Articles. Anyway, I'll email you about it. But Catholics aren't emancipated until well into the late 19th century.
sure. Jeff asked a question in the chat. I'm going to do this and then I'm going to be quiet, or I'm going to let us talk more about the book. So Jeff asked about communion and transubstantiation. For those who don't know what transubstantiation is, it is the idea that by the blessing of the priest, the communion wafer and the communion wine literally transform into the blood and body of Christ. Transubstantiation also becomes a piece of Reformation, not the English Reformation, but just one of the things religion in general has to figure out. Christian religion has to figure out on which side it's going to stand. Anglicans don't believe in the literal transformation of the blood of the wine and the wafer into the blood and the body. They believe in the metaphorical use of what's called the Lord's Supper, but they don't believe that this transformation happened. So the Anglicans did break with the belief of communion, but they still use the Eucharist, which is the bread that's handed out to everyone. All right, any other questions about the Reformation or anything else that I've yammered on about for about 20 minutes?
Well, I'm certainly deeply interested in getting into the book, but since you brought this up, which is interesting, and how it interleaves with the entire book anyway. So I get the impression from Mantell's perspective, I guess, that there were sort of two things going on at the same time. Henry has outspent his income by a lot. He's basically broke, is what I'm understanding.
Mm-hmm.
Primarily for two reasons. One, he's been fighting wars that are foolish wars, and second, because he's just a lavish spender and doesn't know how to stop. So there's a number of mentions about that, you know, with Cromwell discussing how he'd like to see his books because he's pretty sure the man's broke.
Yes.
Then Henry gets it into his head, you know what, if I don't have to be sending all this money to the Pope, I would have a lot more for myself and I could, you know, not be in such dire straits financially. So I see there being sort of this political, financial reason for breaking away from the Catholic Church. Simultaneous with that is this concept of religion for the masses that's brought about by the English Bibles that are being printed and distributed. And it occurs to me that this is a theme that I personally see, and I hope I'm not going to offend anyone. I may do that. I personally see, thank you. I personally see religion as being a very suppressive philosophical aspect that the more you control people by their beliefs and not allowing them to be able to sort of think on their own, the more control you have over those folks. And we see this sadly in Muslim countries where people have no education. Their only education is when they go to the mosque and they go to religious services. So I kind of gather that part of the second part of what's going on, and it happens to coincide with Henry's thinking, is that there's becoming a religion of the masses where we don't have to listen to the cardinals and the bishops and what they're telling us we should be believing. We can read it for ourselves in the book because we're not beholden to this, having to have knowledge of Latin and so forth.
Thank you, Michael. Dom.
Well, just to segue from that for a moment, because I don't know, I mean, I don't see Henry as being concerned about that issue. I mean, he seems to be completely disconnected from what's going on around him. Now, Cromwell perhaps is. I mean, he's the one with the books. Although Henry is literate, he's a royal with literacy. I mean, I get confused when I'm reading this book because, like you're suggesting, there are so many different factions or sub-factions that are going on here. It's not like black and white, which makes for a more interesting story. But going back to what you were originally started talking about, which is explaining Henry's behavior vis-a-vis the church, I also wonder if he's also trying to, given his pedigree, he's trying to reconcile his existence vis-a-vis the lifestyle of other monarchs. I mean, I have to do what the King of France does, maybe better, that sort of thing. Because if he can't establish a court that is comparably, not affluent, but well, affluent and ostentatious, then there's something that diminishes his regal nature. And that's interesting because, I mean, I dipped into a book about within a year or so ago, which was a novelization of what happened when an Islamic potentate or representative goes to England to visit the England of Elizabeth, and he finds it really dismal. It just doesn't compare. So he doesn't find that he doesn't make these comparisons to other courts. So I'm wondering if Henry has some kind of not chip on his shoulder, but inferiority complex vis-a-vis other courts.
I'm going to mount a quick defense of Henry Tudor, Henry VIII, and for his behavior as a human being. So, I believe that Henry is incredibly privileged, and I don't believe it's his fault that he's incredibly privileged. I think that it is the natural state of someone in his position to be treated the way he's treated and to be allowed the things he's allowed. You can't, it's treason to even speak of the king's death or illness. And this is true even before Henry. So the monarch holds this kind of mystical space in England, and actually just monarchies across Europe have this mystical attachment to some sort of ordination of God. So Henry believes he's king in part because God wanted him to be king. And God wanted Henry to be king because he thought Henry would be the right ruler. And then almost immediately, it turns out things don't work out for Henry. We know he can have sons. He has a bastard with Mistress Blount, And that's Henry Fitzroy, who we see on a boat going to Paris, or not Paris, sorry, going to France. But he's not able to have a son with Catherine. And so when he begins to think about his rule, and when he begins to think about his place in God's plan, he starts to worry that he has done something wrong by marrying his brother's widow. And I think it's easy for us as modern readers to read that cynically and think, oh, he's using that as an excuse. But I think this is a legitimate concern for Henry, that God is not blessing him with sons. And then, so he's with Catherine for 20 years when he finally decides, I think I need a newer model. But the avenue to newer model isn't easy. And he finds Anne. And Anne, as Mantell creates her and as Mantell presents her to us, is just fascinating. She's got a quick intelligence. There is a charisma about her. There is, she's often described as not beautiful, but either the word bewitching is used or mesmerizing. I don't think that word is used, but that idea is in there. So one of the reasons Henry becomes so fixated on Anne is because A, she aligns with his beliefs that Rome is not the answer, and she is deeply interesting to him, and he wants this thing he can't have, which is just a thing about, not to men are from Mars, women are from Venus, but men sort of stereotypically, especially in art, tend to want the thing that they don't have access to. There's a great
There are
law.
books, Mike, why men marry bitches. I mean, there's a whole Peter Pan,
There's a great line in part 4 where it's described that Anne is selling herself by inches,
Jeez.
which I thought was a really, really wonderful
Got
and
long
profound line. So Henry, I think, is a romantic. Henry is incredibly religious. Henry is narcissistic, but it's not clear if he is narcissistic because he's a narcissist or if he is narcissistic because he is in a society that expects that of him. If you remember from last week's reading, there's that great moment where Cromwell realizes Henry has never been alone. He's always had people around him. There's always someone attending to his every need. And so, yeah, very good point, Robin. One more thing and then I'll call on you, Anne. So I think it's important for us to read Henry within Mantell's context. And in Mantell's context, there's some insecurity, but there's also, I think, a real urgency on this Henry's part to get it right. And then I think we need to read Henry within his historical context. And we can't expect a man who is a monarch in the 16th century to behave in ways that we might expect of a monarch in the 21st. Anne Bennett.
Henry, I was surprised that he was so superstitious that he was completely undone by the prophetess who said that if he married Anne, his reign would be 7 months, I think. He was scared stiff by her. And I don't know, that surprised me, even though I wasn't surprised that superstition was common then.
Well, Anne, I think you bring up a very good point, which is maybe one of the things we should watch out for in these novels is how does Henry react to women in general? Like, women seem to have a different kind of power over him than the men in his employ do. And it could be sort of the way women in general were viewed. Women often got labeled as witches and sorceresses and prophetesses because women were weird and mysterious and men couldn't understand them. So watching the way Henry reacts to women is probably worth your time in all of the novels. But also watching the way Cromwell reacts to women in the novel is also really interesting. Jeff, I see your hand is raised.
Oh, yes. So I like everything that you've said about Henry. One question I keep asking myself is whether Cromwell buys it. Like, what is his opinion of Henry? What is his opinion of monarchy? And my theory is that Cromwell is fairly cynical in his treatment and sees Henry as a ladder to to raise his own position. And the only time we really see, at least in a very acute sense, that Cromwell cares about all of this stuff happening and the well-being of the king is at the dance in Calais when Anne is off with King Francis in a windowsill, sort of smoozing and carousing, and Henry is sort of trying to make a show of being happy, but Cromwell can tell, oh, this guy is stressed out by Anne's attraction to Francis. And Cromwell says, like, oh, do I really have like a patriotic streak that I'm gonna go solve this problem? And he goes and finds Norfolk. Norfolk grabs Anne, wrests her away, and the king sort of has Henry has a moment where he's like, aha, everything's going according to my plan again.
Well, and a question that I also have this time through, and then I'll call on you, Allison. So I've read this novel countless times, and reading it now with you in this way, I'm starting to doubt. Cromwell's love of Wolsey even, and how much of that relationship was more opportunistic. We've talked about it being sort of a father-son relationship, and there's a psychodrama there that we can get into where the son rebels against the father. But I keep coming back to the fact that Cromwell felt that he couldn't leave court to be with the man who brought him up because he was worried something would happen, but nothing ever happened. And we don't know that nothing ever happened because Cromwell stayed. And I think it would have done Wolsey a world of good to have Cromwell there with him. And then your question about that, or your point about Cromwell's cynicism with Henry, I think Cromwell realizes this is the key. Religion is the key with this guy. If I get what I want by sort of placating his religious mania. Allison, you are on mute, so we are not able to hear you.
Okay.
There you go.
Got it. Yeah. One of the lines I liked very much in the parts that we read recently was when Cromwell says, what a great king Wolsey would have made and how much he would have enjoyed it. And to me, that suggests that he certainly doesn't believe in like the divine right of kings. I mean, he is open to the idea that people who are not, whether they get the throne by blood or whether they get the throne by force, are not necessarily the best people to, lead a nation. So I think that's interesting. And I just think that there's different references scattered throughout where Cromwell feels real hatred for people who abused Wolsey in one way or another, either before or after his demise. And I don't know, maybe I'm reading too much between the lines, but I think there's just one line somewhere where Cromwell goes to have a tete-a-tete with Anne Boleyn, and she's wearing Wolsey's turquoise ring. And I just was like imagining how his, I mean, he never shows anything. I mean, that's one of the big themes of the whole court, right? Everybody's wearing a mask, arrange your face. Think about what people have on underneath, all this. But if he let his feelings show, I just sort of imagined that he would just, his jaw would drop and he would be, I don't know, quite upset.
I'm going to add a little bit to what Allison said. I'm going to call on Marion, and then I'm going to call on Anne Asher. But there's a passage in the novel, in the scene where Cromwell is just telling some harsh truths to Harry Percy about what's available to him. And Percy says that the king respects all ancient titles and all ancient rights. And how can he explain to him the world is not run from where he thinks, not from his border fortresses, not even from Whitehall. The world is run from Antwerp,
right,
from Florence, from places he has never imagined, from Lisbon, from where the ships with sails of silk drift west and are burned up in the sun, not from castle walls, but from counting houses, not by the call of the bugle, but by the click of the abacus, not by the grate and click of the mechanism of the gun, but by the scrape of the pen on the page of the promissory note that pays for the gun and the gunsmith and the powder and the shot. And it's such a wonderfully chilling distillation that shatters even modern ideas of power. The president does not have power.
Yeah.
Corporations with lobbyists and people with
Thanks.
money have that power. Marion, I'd like to call on you.
Okay, I'm following up on something Anne said that really struck me in this part of the book. Is we had talked in the past, like what's under the clothes and what's under the words, and it's all like what's under the facial expressions too. Brought up, like Cromwell talks about Erasmus saying, "Put on your mask first thing in the morning." When Anne is at the ball and she's dancing with a king of France, it's like she has a mask under her mask. And it seems like the only person who can really show what he's feeling is the king, because he has no one to answer to. Everybody else has to just put on these faces according to the role they're playing. And having just seen the Queen's Gambit on television, it just like, this whole thing is like all these chess pieces moving all around to try and get or retain power. And it doesn't seem to be very, very little human emotion. And in this section of the book too, I think Cromwell seems more of that. In the earlier parts of the book, he seemed more, having more real emotions. I mean, towards people, to his wife, to the people in his household, to Wolsey. And he seems to be just moving into being more of a manipulator, and really, you never know from the outside what he's thinking or anything.
2 quick points, and I'll call on Anne Asher. Shakespeare is interesting here. If you look at Macbeth and if you look at Richard III, so in Macbeth, he gets power fairly early and then has to spend the rest of the play fighting to keep it and ultimately loses it. In Richard III, he spends most of the play plotting to get the power, and once he gets it, he has no interest in it. He does not care. But for him, what was exciting and exhilarating was the chase. And so I think it speaks to what you were talking about, Marion. Ann Asher.
Okay, well, 2 points. First of all, I have to disagree about the fact that his loyalty switched to the king completely and that he'd forgotten Wolsey. Because if you remember in the scene when he gives Percy what for, he remembers that Percy was one of the people who was sent to hassle Wolsey.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, and then the other thing which I thought was interesting was where he and Mary Boleyn sort of get kind of chummy in Calais. And then apparently she's made dates with somebody else.
That was embarrassing. Okay, so I'm going to call next on Robin.
Oh, okay.
Yes, the passage, Mike, that you just read about Thomas Cromwell's thoughts in the scene with Harry Percy set me off on a whole train of thought about just how unique Cromwell is among the king's advisors, because his other advisors, it's not only that they have, for the most part, a higher birth than Cromwell's, it's also that they come either from one of the following. They come from the church or the military or perhaps the law, but they have their specialty in their background. They don't have anywhere near the broad knowledge and experience of Cromwell, who knows business, finance, trade, keeps up with new developments through foreign ambassadors, through businessmen in other countries. He knows all the players in every field. He knows, he gains something from his contacts about the arts, about science. He knows a scholar. He not only sees all the pieces of the puzzle, but he knows how to manipulate them. And at least for the way that Mantell presents him in Wolf Hall, he knows how to handle things and deal in good times and in bad times. And he's truly a man for all seasons.
I will allow that. Yes. Janet, you had a point.
Yeah, I was thinking of before he sees Henry Percy and he has to go and talk, he's summoned to the Boleyn's tete-a-tete, and when that line in there that's so striking is when Anne says, well, the cardinal is the one who got rid of him and the cardinal is dead. And I just think, I've just thought, does he want to throttle her? That I mean, really, how does this man keep his emotions under control with these people who?
What he says is he savors the minute. Do you remember? He deliberately does something like stage business to prolong the moment, just to enjoy her discomfiture.
Yeah, but I just think it's more than Oh. Phyllis. She's really responsible for his downfall, really, for Wolsey.
Phyllis, you had a point.
Yes, and the point is, and I think I've said this before, it struck me that, well, I mean, we know what happens to Anne. If you look at it from this point of view, and if you know a little bit about what's coming, it's Cromwell engineers you can even think of him engineering Anne's downfall in retaliation for what he and the others did to Wolsey. So I don't think he's ever disloyal to Wolsey. I think that's a prime motive for him throughout all of this. He has this incredible breadth. He's incredibly, he's the smartest person in the room always, the most educated, the most facile mind, the most open. But he doesn't lose sight of revenge for Wolsey.
All right, Michael Kraft.
Thank you. So I'm going to go back to what the paragraph you quoted and Robin's assessment of it, and bring you back in time to the meeting that Cromwell has with Catherine and her daughter. And he manages to very cleverly persuade her to just stop her fight and quietly go off into the sunset. And the back and forth is kind of interesting. And it's one of those things I had to read a few times to truly dig into understanding what she was getting at. But basically, he had to, on the fly, kind of come up with a threat that could be made that might persuade her that perhaps it was in her best interest not to fight any longer. And ultimately, ironically, in today's 20th century, the threat that he makes is to separate her from her daughter. But I particularly love the final line of the section where she says, "I begin to understand you. The blacksmith makes his own tools." So it was really very much in keeping with all this idea of him being not just an expert tradesman, but also very clever in how to work political deals.
Okay, I'm going to call on Ann Bennett, and then Dom, and then Allison.
Okay, how to unmute? Well, there's a scene in here that says a lot about the relationship of Cromwell to Henry. When Francis tries to bribe Cromwell, by putting the jewel in the glove, and then in the next scene, Cromwell goes immediately to Henry, who was playing bowls, and the king looks up at him, his eyes saying, well, his eyes, Cromwell, say alone. The king say later, and not a word is spoken. But all the time the king keeps up his joking and backslapping, says, you see this counselor of mine, I warn you, never play any game with him, for he will not respect your ancestry. He has no coat of arms and no name, but he believes he is bred to win. Well, I think that gives Henry more credit than we're giving him for having some perspicacity. Yeah, Cromwell is, he's gotten so close to him, and the king relies on him. But Cromwell is promoting himself all the time. I mean, that he thought immediately of, well, I guess he knew that he had to give the king the ruby or whatever it was. But I thought the king nailed him, that he doesn't respect titles and ancestry. And when he says he believes he is bred to win, I don't know how much Henry knows about Cromwell's childhood, but as we know, what didn't kill him made him stronger. And I think, was part of the hardship of his childhood, which he refers to in, I think, 2 other places in part 4. One time when he sees the page hit in the head with a bowl or something, and then he hears somebody crying, and he thinks, oh, the page is doubly punished, first for having the accident and then being hit. And, that certainly is Cromwell's story of his childhood with his father. And I think it did make him stronger.
Dominic.
Well, I don't know. Mantell has created a really very modern character here. Sometimes it's almost too fantastic in the sense, the breadth of his knowledge, the breadth of his understanding. And it's this contrast with the people around him that drive the story. And his bedrock, I started reading the book. When I started reading the book, I was inclined to think that his relationship with the cardinal, I think I used the word transactional, because that's the way it came to me in the first few pages. And now it's like, if you want to understand anything that he's done after page 60 or whatever, you refer back to his bedrock, the cardinal and his family. He's the only person here who he's one of the few people here who actually goes home at night, which is interesting. He has a home. I mean, Henry has castles, but Cromwell appears to have a home. He has family. He has real relatives who care for him, and he cares for. And that's why I think his relationship with Wolsey is more is less mechanical, less transactional than I thought initially, because maybe their mutual backgrounds. He developed a genuine relationship with this man and with this other person, and it's one of the few genuine relationships that he has, and it's sort of like the bedrock of the story is his relationship with his family and his relationship with this other person, Wolsey. Everything else is contrast, and the writer embellishes the contrast by making him much more and more idiosyncratic and more modern. That's all I have to say.
Jeffrey Hearn.
Okay, this is a very simple question. Don't give away any spoilers, but do we ever learn in this book what that meeting was about in Calais in a sort of dive bar with 3 sort of very mysterious gentlemen who may or may not possess some schematics of some sort for a device that Cromwell wants access to or built for him?
Yes.
So we do learn more. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. That's all I needed to know.
I'm going to call on Jenna. I'm going to call on Anne. I also want to make sure that we get to the weird relationship between Cromwell and Anne Boleyn. So Jen, please.
So it kind of dovetails to 2 observations I have so far. Like the first one being is, I think Cromwell, because he does not have a privileged background, has learned to make himself indispensable to really important people. He did it to Wolsey first, and then he does it to the king. And there's even a remark at some point where sort of the aristocrats realize he's sort of made himself indispensable to the king. He's always at the king's side, but they don't quite understand how that happened. So I feel like that is one of those things that he actually appreciates about Anne Boleyn, even if he doesn't perhaps like her. I think they both recognize that they're playing an influence game, and there's, I feel like, hat tips to each other going like, I see what you're doing. Like, there's that ploy. I feel like it's 2 manipulators who've come to realize that the king is the center of power and how do I access it, right? The second subset to that, and Mike has seen this question already because I emailed it to him, is when do we discuss what a ninny like Henry VIII is around women? Because he's the king, right? And he's put up with not being able to bed Anne for 6 to 7 years. Like, that's some weird sexual infatuation, obsession that I just don't understand. Is it simply because she is the one woman who has denied him? And, you know, having been the king, including to the point of having married his wife, you know, his brother's widow, because he wanted her? Like, is this simply like a case of, I really, really, really want that, and I haven't been able to put my hands on it? Because it's been going on to 6 to 7 years. Like, that's a really long time for a guy that still has apparently mistresses and goes to other women's beds, right? He makes comments about having gone to other women's beds, but he still manages to stick around with Anne and go like, I'm going to make that one queen. I don't get it.
So one thing that I think in mind is how not firm the Tudor line has on the crown and ruling of England. Henry is only the second Tudor king. And if you can't produce a male heir, the Tudor line ostensibly ends with him. Women, as we will see, we've got Mary I and we've got Elizabeth I, can be monarchs. But that's new. People aren't quite ready for that yet. And I think in Henry's mind, because he does, one of the chapter titles is Alas, What Shall I Do for Love, which is a song Henry wrote, and I'm going to send a link in my follow-up email to a performance of it. It's about a minute. Henry wrote a lot of love songs. They're terrible. He is a romantic, and I think he believes Anne is who he's supposed to be with. And it's also, I think, that sort of investment sink, like, I've put this much time into it, I'm going to look really silly if I back off all of a sudden, or I'm going to lose face. Well, hold on, Alice. So I'm going to call on Anne, who had her hand up, and then Alicia, and then Allison.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, what I noticed is that he also had loyalty and closeness to a lot of the, I guess you call them lollards, but you know, the people who really wanted to not to have the church come between them and the Bible. And remember, he was very involved with the translation of the Bible.
Wait, is this he in this thing you're saying? This is Henry, or is this Cromwell?
No. This is Cromwell.
Okay.
And so he was very much for it, and he knew that it would, at some risk to himself. And but interestingly enough, apparently Anne Boleyn had also read the Bible in translation. Mm-hmm. And I think the king might have too.
The king definitely has, the whole Boleyn family has the Bible in English. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the interesting things about the match between Anne and Henry. Alicia, yes.
Okay, I think we have to put Henry's infatuation with Anne Boleyn in Hollywood terms. Nowadays, these people are on the cover of the National Enquirer, Angelina Jolie, for my parents' generation, Elizabeth Taylor. There are women that are fatal attraction, you know? I mean, they exist, whether you approve of them or not, or share the infatuation. The thing is, there are some people that are absolute honeypots, and that's what Anne was. Second point is, what struck me in reading this section over again is, when I started reading this kind of history, I thought, Cromwell works and everybody else is at leisure. But then I realized, no, everybody has a job, and they're all patronage jobs. And if Mary Boleyn doesn't drop her drawers, the whole family is going to be gotten rid of, because she's Henry's plaything while Anne is stringing him along towards marriage. I mean, everybody's dancing on their toes as fast as they can. That came to mind. What we haven't discussed is Cromwell's relationship with Mary Boleyn. You're talking about his relationship with Anne Boleyn, like, you know, he's not attracted to her, but he understands the fatal attraction that Henry has. But he can't seem to, he almost gets mixed up with Mary a couple of times. The first time when Mary has, she's obviously missed a period and she's looking for some guy who can take paternity. Then it turned out to be a false alarm. That was at the very beginning. And then she sets up this thing with Cromwell, and it turns out the only reason she's done it is that William Stafford appears to have stood her up, and he hasn't really stood her up. You know, so Cromwell's not immune to women or the charms of the Boleyn family. It's just not Anne Boleyn. And fourthly, Norfolk. This goes to underline how fragile, Mike's point, the dynasty is, because Norfolk's grandson in the reign of Elizabeth I is going to charge up to Mary Queen of Scots and try and bust her out of jail and marry her and put her on the throne of England with him, because he is a descendant of the Plantagenets. He gets his head chopped off by Elizabeth I. I mean, the Norfolks, Uncle Norfolk, he's for real.
Allison.
Well, one thing is, sorry if my mind is in the gutter or what here, or maybe I'm hallucinating, but wasn't there something at some point in the story where somebody was at least speculating that as these years went by with Henry, that he was unable to perform women that he was trying to go after? I thought that there was something that could be interpreted that way, but I can't remember. I can't pin.
There was an allusion to that.
So
There was fear that Henry would not be able, like if he eventually got to Anne, he wouldn't be able to get it up. And then interestingly, when it gets to the point where Anne has decided, I can take the risk and let him go to bed with me because we've sworn something, Henry decides, I'm going to hold off until this is official.
Yeah, because
And so,
doesn't want to have another bastard.
right.
that
One of,
was my answer to part of why he was willing to wait. I mean, if he wasn't he was trying with other women and he wasn't having success, that wouldn't exactly, be an outlet, a very successful outlet for him. But the other thing I wanted to say is, the Boleyn women, both of the sisters, had spent time at the French court. And I think in a sense, not only was Cromwell like really well matched as, in a enemy sense or a frenemy sense with Anne Boleyn, but that may also have something to do with why he was interested in her sister, to some extent, found them attractive, because I think that a lot of why Cromwell, how he got to where he was and how he was so effective, besides all these, innate intelligence and memory and things that he had, was the time that he had spent abroad and, living abroad and meeting these people abroad and learning about the economies of these places abroad, and so forth, that, and that was very good. And I think if you think about like Anne Boleyn and Henry's attraction to her, well, once you set aside Catherine, except for the Boleyn women, you don't get the impression that any of the other women at court have the kind of, polish or finesse that these people got from being at a court abroad. We're constantly told that England is sort of, small potatoes, or this sort of the poor cousin of these other royal entourages.
So one of the things that I wanted to talk about is that relationship between Cromwell and Anne. And one of the important things, the thing that makes Anne more valuable than her sister is at least her professed or her market appearance of virginity. Now, we hear a couple of times that I think with Harry Percy, she's gone, as far as two people can be and not be married. And we understand that she allows the king to rub her thigh. But Anne understands innately that as soon as there's even a rumor of her not being faithful, she's out of the running to be queen. And because Henry needs a woman that hasn't been with anyone else, because he needs to be able to prove that any children that come from that match are his children. Hopefully they're men. They won't be with Anne. I think there is this interesting chemistry, this sexual chemistry that isn't fulfilled. I don't think they have sex, but there's a sexual chemistry between Cromwell and Anne. And I think Jen really summed it up beautifully when she said, it's sort of two makers who know each other. Like, okay, I'm interested in watching how you do this. And I'm also, and then the other person's all, I'm interested in seeing how you navigate this. And it's interesting to see that alignment and the way that they joke with each other. One of my favorite scenes is when Anne is so excited to tell Cromwell about what's been going on at Wolf Hall, which is disgusting. And just like she gets really close, and Mantell mentions that Cromwell can smell her perfume and it's amber and something else. And amber has sort of a dark, sexy, sexual smell to it. So that's interesting. Alicia.
I didn't pick up on that at all. I know in the TV series that you don't want us to talk about, they do show Cromwell and Anne being sexually attracted, or at least he being sexually attracted to her. But I read the novel, this is my third time. I haven't picked up on that. And I think he's absolutely disgusted with Anne and repelled by her glee in talking about this family's, total chaos. Because he does like that young girl, he can't really remember her name, the one that cries a lot.
Jane Seymour.
No, but he doesn't know she's Jane Seymour. We don't know nobody at court knows she's Jane Seymour. She's just that
Seymour girl.
Yeah. Her brothers can't even remember how old she is. It's like there's
they don't know how old she is.
Yeah, but I mean, but it's kind of saying her that she's so unimportant compared to like Henry's sisters. One marries the King of France, the other marries the King of Scotland. I mean, who else to marry?
Jeff, you had raised your hand.
Yes, to completely disagree with Alicia, because there's a scene, I think it's right when Thomas More is sort of losing his power, where Anne and Cromwell are on a balcony above some sort of courtyard. And Cromwell looks at Anne, and he's looking at her collarbone in a very attracted sexual way. And I think Cromwell also recognizes that Anne is a mirror to his tapestry, and she is he's projecting on her a lot of his past loves, the way he projects Liz on sort of every other woman.
Yeah, I think, hold on. No, not there. Next day, he stands in a gallery at Whitehall, which looks down on an inner court, a garden where the king waits and the Duke of Norfolk busies to and fro. Anne is in the gallery beside him. She is wearing a dark red gown of figured damask, so heavy that her tiny white shoulders seem to droop inside it. Sometimes, in a kind of fellowship of the imagination, he imagines resting his hand upon her shoulder and following with his thumb the scooped hollow between her collarbone and her throat. Imagines with his forefinger tracking the line of her breast as it swells above her bodice, as a child follows a line of print. Yeah, that's some sexy stuff right there. So
Yeah, you know what? When you just read that, I had a different thought. I originally thought of it as a sexual situation. But let's remember that Cromwell was an assassin of sorts. And just then, when you read it, I thought he might be thinking about taking her out.
Is she foreshadowing Mantell? You know,
Right. You know, there's a great anecdote from the Lord of the Rings films where Christopher Lee just sort of shares, oh, that's not the way someone sounds when they're stabbed. They sound like this. And you find out he knows that they sound like this because he used to stab people in the war. So yeah, it's
Well,
fantastic.
that's, I mean, I actually, I'm telling you, I completely thought of it as a sexual situation until the way you just read it. I said, that's really interesting. If you were about to strangle someone, this might be exactly what you'd be thinking, what's going through your head.
I think Cromwell is doing two things at this point. I think on the one hand, he is fascinated by Anne. And on the other hand, he is gathering information about Anne. Like he keeps hearing little bits of gossip from different people. One of my favorite, I won't read it because it's gross, but when Cromwell is on a boat with a man from Putney, and the man from Putney sort of acts out what he thinks the conversation is like between Anne Boleyn and her brother George.
Oh God, yes.
Yeah. And it ends with, thanks, he says. I had no idea how they managed. So, but he needs, so on the one hand, Cromwell traffics in information. I've talked before in different situations about what is the currency when money isn't the issue. And money is not an issue for Cromwell, but information now becomes currency, and he can use that as he needs to. If he needs to help raise Anne up, he knows where the rumors are to quash. And if he has to bring Anne down, spoiler alert, he now knows where he needs to go. And thank you, Michael Kraft. There's a great moment. I think we read it last time, where Cromwell finds out that Thomas More has been spreading the rumor that Wolsey has the pox and is trying to give it to the king.
Mm-hmm.
And Cromwell thinks to himself, how can someone create that rumor? How can someone then spread that rumor? And it's almost like this, oh, you sweet baby angel. And then what we're going to see, and again, spoiler alert, we're going to see Cromwell have to traffic in rumor and lie. I think he realizes the power there is in a rumor. And it doesn't matter if it's true, it matters if it's believed. Any other final thoughts before we bid each other a pleasant good evening? Any questions about my plans for going forward? Jeffrey Hearn.
I have a question about, it's a scene just 2 pages before the end of this book where we meet Anselma in Cyprus, and we see a glimpse of Cromwell at a crossroads between going into the east, like into the Holy Land, and sort of becoming totally obscure and part of basically a completely foreign world, or returning to Europe and making a life there. That sort of puzzled me. Like, what is it? Just his sort of wanderlust that is guiding him to just sort of forsake Europe altogether?
I wonder if Cromwell is starting to realize that as deep as he is now, the only way now is through. Like there's no, and I think that is sort of, I think it was maybe Robin who mentioned this earlier, and then I brought up Macbeth and Richard III. But one of the things that I wonder, maybe this happens to Cromwell, is everyone around him is so dull, is so smart, that he then becomes overconfident and forgets that he can fail. And that may be the problem. When you're the smartest person in the room, and you realize you're the smartest person in the room, and you realize you don't have to work as hard, and that could be part of his undoing as well. Alicia.
And you forget that you have a boss and you don't want to outsmart your boss in a way that he realizes he's been outsmarted. You
Yes.
can't upstage, the king or the CEO or whatever.
All right, well, thank you all very much. I loved tonight's discussion a whole lot. I loved seeing all of you. We will meet again in 2 weeks. So the Thursday after Thanksgiving, you will probably, are you waving goodbye or do you want to say something first? Okay. You will probably be able to audibly hear me expanding because I plan on eating a lot of crescent
Wait.
rolls.
Thursday after Thanksgiving?
Sorry, the Wednesday after Thanksgiving. Sorry. The Wednesday after Thanksgiving. We will meet again to discuss part 5. And then we have part 6. And then the 7th discussion will be just sort of a round robin about the novel as a whole. Your insights were fantastic. One of the things I love about talking to people about books is I literally always leave with a new idea that I did not come to the meeting with, that changes a lot for me about what I've just read and what I'm about to read. So you give me a gift that I can never repay, and that's lovely. Thank you for doing that. And I will talk with you in 2 weeks and by email.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye.
Okay, bye.
Hey, everyone.